Hi,
Hello.
thanks for joining me. I'm just gonna read an introduction really quick, and then we can get started with our conversation today.
Awesome.
So for anyone who doesn't know, I am Elvia Limón. I am the engagement producer here at the Texas Tribune. And before I introduce our guest today, I want to thank Lone Star College, Texas State Technical College, and law offices of Carlos Eduardo Cardenas, PC, for presenting this event. And now to the topic of this week. I'm joined today by Julián Aguilar. Julián reports on politics, immigration, and border security issues for the Texas Tribune from El Paso. His political coverage includes immigration reform and enforcement, international trade, border security, and the drug trade. In 2019, Julián's reporting on Families Divided won 4 National Edward R. Murrow Awards. And if you have any questions for Julián, please use the chat function at the bottom of the screen. And let's get started. So we are going to talk about gun control in Texas. And before we get started, we kind of need to understand how that plays a role in Texas. So can you speak a little bit about the role in guns in the Second Amendment and how they play in Texas culture and among state leaders?
Yeah. Real quick, thank you for having me on here. Appreciate it. An important topic. Yeah, I mean, if you ask a lifelong Texan, when they got their first rifle or their first pair of cowboy boots, they probably scratch their head and have to think on it for a while. Including myself in that group. It's just guns in Texas is like football in Texas or barbecue in Texas. I mean, you throw out another cliche, but that's just kind of the way it goes. About that, and so I mean, so for example, Texas Gun Sense, right? A very well-known gun reform advocacy group. Their folks are CHL holders. So it just kind of shows that it's not necessarily a partisan issue. It's a very broad way of living here in Texas. We're a very rural state in some areas, so lots of farmers, lots of ranchers have guns for protection, for hunting. We're a big hunting state. We're still a large agricultural state. We're also a very metropolitan state, which means a lot of law enforcement, a lot of inner city. So guns in Texas is again football in Texas, barbecue in Texas, cowboy boots. I mean, they just kind of go hand in hand, and it's not. I think compared to other states, it's not as much of a partisan issue with respect to gun ownership and just the knowledge of the guns. That's not to say that gun control is not a partisan issue, which we'll get to that. So yeah, I mean, the background of guns in Texas is just we could talk about that for days.
Yeah. So I mean, we're talking about this right now, and we're talking to you because you live in El Paso.
Mm-hmm.
So of course we all know about the mass shooting that happened in El Paso Walmart. So how did officials react after that mass shooting in El Paso?
So we're going on about 18 months since that mass shooting. 23 people lost their lives. It was not spillover violence from Mexico. It wasn't cartel related. It wasn't anything like that. It was an alleged white supremacist that drove from Allen, Texas, a suburb of Dallas, that came to do our community harm, to send a message. Immediately the reaction was what you would expect. A lot of tears, a lot of anger, a lot of frustration, and the inevitable questions like, how do we prevent this from happening again? And unfortunately, just a few weeks after what happened in El Paso, we saw something similar happen in the Midland and Odessa area. Thankfully with a fewer number of casualties, but it still, sent shockwaves to that community. A day after El Paso, not even a full day, we saw another tragedy in Dayton, Ohio. So the immediate reaction was, town halls. Let's talk about what we can do. But since then, we've had a pandemic where Texas lawmakers are facing a budget crisis. We have a lot of other issues that lawmakers from El Paso and other places in Texas, to be fair, that have been fighting for some sort of gun control, feel that that's kind of taken the air out of the conversation. So if we go back to 18 months, a lot of intensity, a lot of anger, a lot of questions, a lot of coming together about what we can do next. But that's not necessarily the way some lawmakers see that playing out now, so many months down the road.
So you mentioned the town halls. How did those look like, and who participated in those town halls?
I mean, there was a lot. Obviously, the El Paso delegation, just stakeholders from various organizations, and folks were positive that a lot of the ideas that kind of got bounced around in those town halls that would come into play. Former state rep, now state senator Cesar Blanco, he sent out a press release and talked to Sammy Sparber, which real quick before I forget, people should go back and read Sammy Sparber's story on gun control in the El Paso and Odessa delegation, and she did a really, really fantastic job of breaking that down. That aired, or that was published earlier this month. But she quoted Cesar Blanco, now a state senator, saying, we hope that this won't lose steam in the legislature. I'm paraphrasing, obviously, but so the senator said that the legislation that he has filed came out of those sort of brainstorming ideas. There was a lot of talk about should lawmakers go back into an immediate special session after these two shootings. Obviously, that didn't happen. So we're going to see kind of what plays out. It's early, we're mid-February. Even in pandemic, standards, the legislature is obviously having to adapt and adjust to the way the process is, but it's still early and a lot can change in the next 3.5 months before they gavel out. So it'd be interesting to watch, what happens in committee, what happens with amendments on certain larger bills and things like that. But with respect to those town halls, a lot of lawmakers came out, thinking, okay, we're finally going to get some bipartisan support, because Middle and Odessa, obviously, it's the Panhandle. It's a very conservative area, where El Paso, votes Democratic. So they thought, okay, well, maybe both sides can come together and try to craft some legislation that will make it to the governor's desk.
So speaking about the governor, how was his reaction when it first happened, and has it changed, or, what is he saying about this?
Well, his reaction, he and Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick and then Speaker of the House Dennis Bonnen, of course they responded with shock and outrage, and they were very sad, and they came down and they met with the community. But Governor Abbott did also have to say, mistakes were made on his campaign's behalf, because it came out later that there was a campaign mailer that talked about, taking matters into our own hands. We have to defend the border. And a lot of people say that that's the rhetoric that needs to go away with respect to gun violence, especially on the border communities. He seemed receptive. Again, he had these town halls. He spoke with a lot of lawmakers. But we saw, less than 2 weeks ago during his State of the State that he also wants to make Texas a sanctuary state for gun owners. So the members of the El Paso delegation that I spoke with recently said, that wasn't surprising, given the fact that Texas is a red state, and the governor has made his opinions on gun control very well known. But obviously for obvious reasons, they are concerned about whether those statements and that sort of ideology is going to prevent them from getting any gun control measures passed this session. It's a very red meat issue. The governor may or may not face a challenger on the Democratic side when he runs for re-election, if he runs for election, if he doesn't seek higher office. So, this what he said wasn't surprising to anybody. It's Texas politics, and that's what he said, and nobody was really shocked.
So you mentioned the special session. So do we know why he didn't call a special session? And it kind of goes into my second question, which is, you said it happened in 2019. So why are we talking about it now?
We're talking about it now. Yeah, sure. Sorry to cut you off, but yeah, I mean, the Texas legislature meets every other year, right, for 180 days every other year. So that's why we're talking about it now. Obviously, this happened in 2019 in August, which was the summer immediately after the most recent session. So this was the most logical time that things were going to get mentioned again. With respect to a special session, the governor can call. He's the only one that can call a special session. He can do it any time. He didn't do it. There was a lot of talk about, will he or won't he in August and September of 2019. Obviously, he didn't. But again, going back to just the way Texas politics is, a lot of people were not surprised that he didn't call lawmakers back to tackle this very controversial issue, even though the state had 2 mass shootings within 3 weeks of each other.
So you mentioned that you spoke to El Paso lawmakers recently. So what are they doing to bring this topic up in the Texas legislature this session?
Well, so I spoke yesterday with Chairwoman Gonzalez, Mary Gonzalez, a member of the El Paso delegation out of Clint, just a small city just east of here, who is also named vice chair of appropriations. And she said, look, I mean, let's be honest, right? The Democrats don't have control of the legislature, so they're going to have to obviously, sort of pull back their expectations. She was a little concerned that gun control didn't get mentioned in the governor's state of the state. The session is just getting started, so she's cautiously optimistic. But they're going to try and see where they can make specific gains. For example, on appropriations, that's the biggest bill of the session, and there's a lot of amendments, riders that can kind of go in that will affect certain policy changes without going through the normal legislative process. And Mary also brought up, Chairwoman Gonzalez also brought up a very, very good point. It's like, okay, so the pandemic has obviously taken a lot of attention away from other things that would have been discussed. But let's talk about, the pandemic, and let's focus on that. Depression, suicide, a lot of these issues play into the pandemic, but they also play into gun control, right? So she's saying, we're going to investigate, we're going to look at issues where we can maybe try to make some movement on gun control laws that are, I guess, a little bit more subtle. That's my word, not her word, but a little bit more subtle as they move through the process that aren't as shocking, right? I mean, the headline coming out of Texas, Texas passes a bill, gun control, universal gun control, or background checks and gun control for everybody. I mean, that would obviously get a lot of attention, but it's the things that they can do that are, I think, less controversial, that more people will agree on. So that I think that's where there's going to be a focus initially, and then we'll see how things start going in the committee process.
Did she mention any specifics when it comes to like the subtle approach of this, or anything that they're looking at right now, or she's looking at right now?
Oh, yeah, I mean, well, there's been, as of about 2 weeks ago, the El Paso delegation had filed 19 bills addressing gun control in all sorts of shapes and sizes and forms. Chairman Anchia, Representative Rafael Anchia out of Dallas, had filed one just recently. So, yeah, I mean, it's going to take some time to kind of look at the legislation and see what has a chance. But it's worth mentioning, on the other side, Representative Chairman Guerin, a Republican from Fort Worth, he's filed legislation that would make, lying on a form, or lying with respect to when you're filling out a form for a background check, or to apply for a weapon, to purchase a weapon, it would make that a state penalty also, as opposed to just a federal penalty. So there is some bipartisan support. There is some optimism, I think, with the El Paso delegation, and with other Democrats that aren't a part of the Paso delegation with respect to gun control. But this is what happens with the legislature, right? I mean, a lot of people that that aren't wonks think, okay, well, this is the bill, this is the black and white language, this is what it's proposing. In the next 8-12 weeks, the way committees go, the way House and Senate debates go, there is a lot of opportunity to address the situation in ways that aren't traditional. But there's also a lot of opportunities for a lot of these bills and proposals to die in that process. So that's kind of the other side of the coin, so to speak.
So related to that, do we know how many of these bills that have been filed might be passable or might not? What is the probability of them becoming actual laws?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think it's safe to say that any sort of massive gun control bill, again, universal background checks or something like that would really, really jar the system. I don't think anybody's going to bet money that those are going to get, out of committee or even a committee hearing. So there, a lot of folks wisely are hesitant to predict what's going to pass and what's not going to pass right now. But it's up to the El Paso delegation, from what I've been told, is to really keep this issue in the spotlight, right? To not let this die down after 18 months because we have a pandemic, which deserves a lot of attention for obvious reasons. Public education, the budget, all these things that take up a lot of the oxygen, a lot of attention, deservedly so. But it's on these delegation members to keep this issue at the front of their agenda, so to speak, so to make sure it doesn't kind of die down. Right now, it's probably a little early to see what's going to pass. I mean, again, going back to the urgency right after El Paso to see what's happened in between there. I mean, we saw what happened with Shelley Luther, right? We saw what happened when the state and the governor tried to, put restrictions in place to prevent the spread of COVID-19. There was a backlash on that, so they reversed course on that. We saw less than a week ago the lieutenant governor declare the Star Spangled Banner an emergency, a priority item, which the priority items in the Senate are the top 20 bills. The lieutenant governor said since then that, he's going to lay out the rest of his priorities. But I mentioned those two issues as just an example of what else has come up and what else is on the radar now since the shooting and what's going to get priority. And also just kind of, to illustrate the state of play on where the Texas Republican leadership, who has control of the legislature, where their priorities are.
So as we're getting to the end of our discussion, I just wanted to ask you if you can tell us a little bit about your experience with covering the fallout as a journalist and as a El Paso resident. How was your experience covering the shooting in 2019?
It was one of those events that, as a journalist, you're never going to forget. And as an El Pasoan, it's the same thing. I mean, the shooting happened about 3 blocks away from where I went to high school, so it's a neighborhood that I'm very, very familiar with. When I was driving to the scene, I remember it very, vividly. I think I saved, a screenshot of the text message from the county, the shelter-in-place text. When you think, it sounds like a cliche. Well, it sounds like a cliche because it is a cliche. You think, no way this could happen here, and all of a sudden you're driving into a situation where it does happen. But we haven't forgotten it. El Paso hasn't forgotten it. We're a tough town. We're a compassionate town. We're going to get by, but we haven't forgotten. We want to make sure that this, El Paso Strong isn't just a hashtag, that something comes of it, something that informs people about, what the circumstances are behind what happened, and that it doesn't happen again. So it's still very jarring, whether I'm on assignment as a reporter or whether I'm having, beers with my cousin in his garage. It's still something that people talk about a lot.
Has it changed the community, aside from, talking about it? Has there been any change since before and now, since the shooting?
I mean, initially, right? There was what happens after tragedies, where everybody sort of rallies around folks. I mean, I saw it in the community, as far as 6 months afterward, where people just seem to still be like, everybody just take a step back. Let's appreciate what we have. Let's realize what just happened. Let's be nice to each other. I mean, the politics of the pandemic, the business shutdowns, that divided El Pasoans a little bit, the way it did in everywhere else in the country. But again, I think now that the legislature is back in session and that people start to realize more the division in gun control between what can be done at the state level and the federal level, I think that this conversation is gonna gain some steam. Our recently elected mayor, Oscar Leeser, he was part of the Democratic response to the state of the state. Obviously the El Paso shooting affected him, but it'd be interesting to see what happens at the local level. But yeah, I mean, this is something that's people still talk about. You still see El Paso Strong bumper stickers, billboards, everywhere you go. Nobody's ever going to forget what happened a year and a half ago in this town, ever.
So I have one audience question. Sure. From at Bitterrooney. So they asked, what can they do in order to follow this legislation and get their lawmakers' attention about this topic during this legislative session?
It's a great question. I'm glad to ask. Get more people involved in the legislative process overall, right? Not just on this issue, but the Texas legislature actually does a really, really good job of streaming the proceedings. The Tribune, obviously, I have a bias, but say cover the Tribune for our coverage, but just kind of pay attention and learn a little bit about the process. Realize what can happen in the House doesn't necessarily happen in the Senate, but also lawmakers, their contact information is posted. Whether you're for or against any sort of control, make your voice heard, reach out to them, send those folks some emails, but just definitely keep track of the process, learn about the process, and be engaged. And then also this is a state issue with respect to what we're talking about now, but they can also, bug their city council members, bug the mayor, bug those folks and say, hey, look, this is what I feel. Can you be my voice in Austin and let those people know that this is how I feel? Just communication. It sounds very simple, but it's very effective. And also just kind of knowing the process and realizing that things aren't going to change overnight. And then getting involved with whatever group you think aligns with whatever you're thinking. There's plenty of groups that are out there that are very informed about this issue. So, it takes an email or a phone call maybe, and then, to learn a little bit more.
Great. Well, with that, we're out of time. I want to thank everyone who tuned in today, and I want to thank you, Julián, for joining us today and answering our questions. And for more coverage and the latest important Texas news, go to texastribune.org. And thanks, everyone, and I'll see you in 2 weeks. Thanks, Julián.